Welcome to Deepu Cotter Stories. You won't believe how far two men would go to enforce a rule that didn't even exist. In a town obsessed with perfect lawns, Dr. Alani Reid committed the ultimate crime. She planted a garden. This simple act of joy triggered a shocking escalation from her neighbors. Two men who crowned themselves the neighborhood security. It started with fake warning letters. Then came the daily intimidation. It ended with them physically putting their hands on her. Trying to perform a citizen's arrest on her own property, they thought they were the law. They were about to learn a brutal lesson about what real authority looks like, because the man who stepped out of the car to stop them wasn't just her husband, he was the new sheriff. A garden of one's own. The day began with a deceptive gentleness on Magnolia Drive. It was a Tuesday in early May. The 10th, to be exact, in the small, quiet town of Serenity Creek, Georgia. The air hung warm and sweet, thick with the scent of cut grass and blooming azaleas. It was the kind of morning that felt safe, unchanging, at the house numbered 214. However, a quiet act of rebellion was taking root in the earth. Dr. Alani Reid was on her knees, in her new front yard. Not in supplication, but in a focused, deliberate act of creation. Her hands, nimble and stained with the dark. Damp soil, cradled a small plant as if it were something precious. An echinacea purpurea, a purple cone flower. To the untrained eye, it was a simple wildflower. But to Alani, a botanist by trade and a naturalist by soul, it was a declaration. It was the first word in a new story she intended to write upon this land. This perfectly manicured, aggressively uniform sea of green, it was a desert, in its own way. And she was here to bring back the oasis, a sanctuary for bees and butterflies, a living tapestry of native plants. Her mark, her garden, a profound sense of peace washed over her as she gently firmed the soil around the roots. She had found a home. From the shade of the front porch, her husband watched her. Marcus Thorne. He was a tall man, built solid, with a stillness about him that was both calming and authoritative. He held two heavy ceramic mugs of coffee, the steam coiling lazily into the humid air. He walked over, his presence a comforting weight beside her. He made a joke, a soft-spoken observation that she was officially declaring war on the tyranny of neighborhood uniformity. Alani's laugh was the clear, bright sound of genuine happiness. It was a sound that had been too rare in the hustle of their old city life. They spoke for a moment. Their words were easy, weaving a comfortable pattern in the quiet morning. They had been in this house for only 2 weeks. This was supposed to be their time of peace, their soft landing, a tranquil period to simply exist before the true reason for their move began. Next month, Marcus would step into his new role, county sheriff. It was a significant detail, a heavy title, and it was a secret they guarded closely. They wanted a chance to be neighbors first. Just Alani and Marcus, not the sheriff and his wife. Marcus's eyes, trained to see more than the average person, drifted across the street. He saw him, the neighbor. He saw the way the man stood, frozen behind his lawnmower. He saw the unblinking stare, a cold, analytical gaze. Marcus felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the low hum of a problem on the horizon. But he said nothing. Alani was in her element, her face alight with a creative joy he would not diminish. He would not let the shadow from across the street touch her. Not yet. Across the street, the world was a different place. There, the primary sound had been the sharp, angry whine of a lawnmower's engine, a sound of control, of order being imposed upon nature, and then, abruptly, that sound had ceased. The man standing behind the machine was Bartholomew Higgins. Bart, a man who had retired early from a 40-year career as a chief accountant. a profession that had shaped his entire worldview. Life was a ledger. Everything had its place. There were assets and liabilities, credits and debits. For 20 years, he had lived on this street, and he considered himself its chief auditor, a silent, unappointed guardian of its standards, its value. His eyes, small and pale, were fixed on the scene unfolding at number 214. The frown on his face was not a fleeting expression, it was a permanent fixture, carved by years of quiet disapproval. He saw the woman, he saw the dark, messy disruption of the soil on the pristine, unbroken plane of the lawn. It was an error in the books, an ugly ink blot. He saw the strange, weedy-looking plant she was introducing into this controlled environment. A foreign variable, an unacceptable deviation. To Bart, this was not gardening. This was chaos. This was an act of profound disrespect to the unspoken rules that held their perfect little world together. He did not need to speak. His silence was a judgment. A verdict had already been reached. With a stiff, precise movement, Bart turned. He pushed the mower into his immaculate garage, where every tool hung in its designated place. He walked into his home. The air inside was cool, still, and smelled faintly of lemon polish. From a locked drawer in his heavy oak desk, he removed a book. It was a substantial ledger, bound in dark, unforgiving leather. This was not a diary. It was a record, a dossier of the neighborhood's failures. He opened it to a clean annotation. Empty page. His silver pen glinted under the light from the window. The pen moved across the paper with the cold certainty of an accountant finalizing a balance sheet. At the very top, the address, 214 Magnolia Drive. Beneath it, the date, Tuesday, May 10th. And then, the first official entry, the beginning of a new file. The words were stark, devoid of emotion. New homeowner has commenced destruction of established landscape. Monitoring is required. He closed the book. The heavy cover made a soft, final thud in the silence of the room. Outside, the Georgia sun shone down, warming the petals of the small purple coneflower. But in the cool, quiet house across the street, a shadow had just been given a name and a number. The whispers of Serenity Creek. In the locked leather ledger, on the page for 214 Magnolia Drive, new entries appeared. Neat, precise, cold. Wednesday, 3 new shrubs planted. A species unidentified. Friday, mulch has been added. The damage spreads. Monday, subject spent 4 hours in the yard. Progress on the unauthorized project is accelerating. The book was no longer just a record. It had become the scripture of Bart's growing obsession. A week passed. The new garden was no longer a single flower. It was an idea taking shape. Patches of sage and verbena began to soften the sharp edges of the lawn. Small blueberry bushes stood in a hopeful row. To Alani, it was a place of life. To the rest of the street, it was becoming a question mark. A topic of conversation. A whisper. And Bart was the one who gave the whispers their words. His campaign began subtly. During his evening walks, he would stop to chat with a neighbor watering their roses, or another fetching their mail. He spoke in terms of community, of shared responsibility. He used carefully chosen phrases, affecting property values. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A lack of respect for the established rules. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He was planting seeds of doubt, and the fertile ground of suburban anxiety did the rest. He found his first true convert 2 houses down. Gary Finch. Gary was a man of about 40. A handyman who lived with his elderly mother. He was a man who felt perpetually overlooked by the world. A ghost in his own life story. He craved purpose. He yearned for respect. And Bart Higgins, with his educated way of speaking and his talk of standards and regulations, seemed to offer both. Bart gave Gary a uniform, not of cloth, but of purpose. He made Gary feel like a deputy blank, a partner in a vital mission. With his new ally secured, Bart decided it was time to move from surveillance to education. One afternoon, he saw Alani weeding near the sidewalk. He approached. A thin, artificial smile stretched across his face. In his hand, he carried a sheaf of papers, a prop to lend him an air of officialdom. He began indirectly. He spoke of her enthusiasm. He called her efforts energetic. Then, he got to the point. He spoke of the community's standards, the unspoken agreement that kept Serenity Creek so serene. He suggested, with a tone that was not a suggestion at all, that she should consider returning the lawn to its traditional state. Alani listened patiently. She did not interrupt. She read him instantly. The feigned friendliness, the condescending tone, the desperate need for control. When he finished, her response was quiet, polite, but firm as steel. She asked to see the specific written regulation from the Homeowners Association that prohibited a native plant garden. The question caught Bart off guard. His smile faltered. He shuffled his prop papers, which were nothing more than old utility bills, written rules. He had not anticipated a demand for evidence. He stammered. He spoke vaguely of unwritten laws, of common understanding. The authority he had projected moments before evaporated under the calm, intelligent gaze of this woman. This black woman, this doctor. Who was she to question him? The thought burned. A hot coal of indignation in his chest. Defeated, he offered a curt nod and retreated, his back stiff with humiliation. Later that evening, he sat with Gary in his perfectly organized garage. He recounted the story. But in his version, he was the calm voice of reason, and Alani was the aggressive, defiant rule breaker. He fanned the flames of Gary's own resentments. She thinks she's better than us. Gary, she thinks the rules don't apply to her. Gary, loyal and eager, nodded in agreement. His sense of purpose had been threatened. His newfound authority had been challenged by proxy. Bart leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. The initial annoyance had now hardened into a personal vendetta. She wants paperwork, Bart said, his voice low and determined. Fine, we'll give her paperwork. He turned to an old computer on his workbench. The screen flickered to life. He opened a simple design program, and he began to type, Serenity Creek Homeowners Association, Aesthetic and Security Committee, a committee that did not exist. A new fiction was being written. The rules of unwritten laws. The hum of the printer was the only sound in Bart's quiet study. It slid a single sheet of paper into the tray. Bart picked it up carefully, as if it were a legal document of great importance. The letterhead he had designed looked impressive enough. Oficial. Even. A few days later, Alani found it in her mailbox. It was a crisp, white envelope, heavy paper, her name and address typed neatly on the front. A flicker of unease went through her. It felt different from the usual junk mail and bills. Inside, a single page was waiting. It was a formal letter, filled with clumsily worded legal phrases and numbered subsections. It cited fabricated bylaws. It spoke of non-compliant landscaping and aesthetic violations. It demanded the complete removal of her garden within 7 days. Failure to comply would result in a $500 fine. The penalties, the letter warned, would escalate from there. For a moment, sitting in her kitchen, Alani felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The weight of authority, even questionable authority, could feel heavy. But then she read it again, slower this time. Her mind, trained in the methodical world of scientific research, began to analyze the data. The tone was wrong. It was too aggressive, too personal. The legal terms felt amateurish. like someone trying to sound like a lawyer. This wasn't professional. This was bullying. Suspicion took root. She considered telling Marcus, but a stronger instinct told her to handle this herself first. This was a battle over her garden, her space. She would be the one to defend it. She put the letter down on the counter, went to her laptop, and did a simple search. Serenity Creek HOA Management Company. The result came up immediately. Cambridge Management. A phone number was listed. She dialed. A tired-sounding voice answered. Cambridge. This is Brenda. Alani kept her own voice calm and professional. She introduced herself, gave her address, and explained that she had received a violation notice from something called the Aesthetic and Security Committee. She asked if Brenda could provide more details. There was a sound of typing on the other end of the line. A few moments of silence. Then Brenda's voice returned, flat and devoid of emotion. Ma'am, I have your property file right here. There is no such committee for Serenity Creek. Alani felt a cold wave of confirmation wash over her. So, this letter isn't from you. No. Brenda said, our violation notices look very different. And besides, there are no official complaints or violations logged against your property at all. According to our records, you're in perfect standing. Is there anything else I can help you with? Alani thanked her and ended the call. The truth settled in the quiet kitchen. It was Bart. It had to be. This whole thing was a lie. A cheap, pathetic attempt to intimidate her. The anger was there. A hot spark. But it was mixed with a strange, liberating sense of relief. He had overplayed his hand. He had given her proof. He had shown her exactly who he was. She could have confronted him. She could have called the police. She could have shown the letter to Marcus. But she chose a different path. A quieter. More elegant response. An act of silent defiance. The next morning, she went to the local nursery. An hour later, she was back in her front yard, right at the edge of the lawn. Directly in Bart Higgins' line of sight from his living room window, she dug a new row of holes, and one by one, she planted a line of tall, defiant sunflowers. Across the street, Bart watched from behind his pristine curtains. He had been waiting for a sign of surrender. A wheelbarrow, a shovel digging up the offending plants. Instead, he saw this. Not surrender, not compliance. It was a declaration, a public humiliation. His face flushed a deep, blotchy red. The neat, ordered world inside his head began to tilt on its axis. Gary Finch was sitting on Bart's couch. Watching television, Bart turned away from the window. His hands clenched into tight fists. All right, he said, his voice trembling with a barely controlled rage. It's time we showed them how serious we are. Alani's sunflowers were a brilliant, silent answer, but they just pushed a desperate man over the edge. Bart promised to get serious. And his next move is chilling. If you are standing with Alani, comment Team Alani below. You need to see what happens when these fake police decide to take the law into their own hands in Part 4. A storm in a teacup. The escalation began with a trip to a craft store. Bart and Gary purchased 2 plain, beige-colored polo shirts and a set of iron-on transfer sheets. Back in Bart's garage, he printed the logo he had designed. A simple circle enclosing the words Serenity Creek Security. It was amateurish. It was absurd. But when they put the shirts on, something shifted in their posture. The costume gave them a sense of legitimacy, a license. Bart's strategy moved from paper threats to psychological warfare. The patrols started every afternoon. Around 5 o'clock, Bart and Gary would emerge, clad in their new uniforms. They would walk the length of the street, but their path always slowed as they passed 214 Magnolia Drive. They would stop on the public sidewalk. They would stare, sometimes for a few seconds, sometimes for a full minute. They stared at the garden, at the house, at the windows. They never spoke a word. They didn't have to. Their silent, coordinated presence was a constant, unnerving message. We are watching you. You do not belong here. The poison spread. Bart continued his whisper campaign. His narrative now more pointed. The new people were troublemakers. They refused to follow the rules. They were intentionally lowering the value of the entire neighborhood. Some neighbors, not wanting any trouble, began to keep their distance from Alani. A friendly wave was replaced with a hurried glance away. A shared sidewalk was crossed to avoid a greeting. The space around her began to feel cold, isolated. The weight of it all was becoming too much to carry alone. One evening, Alani sat Marcus down. She laid the fake letter on the coffee table and told him everything. The conversation with Brenda, the sunflowers, the daily patrols. Marcus listened without interruption. His face, usually so calm, became a hard mask. As a law enforcement professional, he saw the pattern instantly. This wasn't a simple neighborhood dispute. This was a campaign of harassment, escalation. The anger he felt was a cold, hard thing, but years of training kept it contained. His first instinct as a husband was to walk across the street and end it, but his training as an officer told him they needed to be smarter, more patient. He gave her clear instructions. Avoid confrontation at all costs. Keep her phone with her. Always. And record everything. Every patrol, every stare, every single incident. Create a record. Create evidence. A few nights later, Alani was reading in the living room. The house was quiet. From the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement. Then, a bright, sharp beam of light cut through the darkness outside, sweeping across her front window. It moved over the walls, the furniture, and then settled on her. Her heart leaped into her throat. She dropped her book and scrambled for her phone. Her fingers fumbling with the screen, she looked out the window. It was Gary Finch. He was standing on the sidewalk, holding a large flashlight. The beam was trained directly on her. She managed to hit the record button, capturing a few shaky seconds of his silhouetted form. The blinding light aimed at her home. Then, as if sensing he was being watched, he clicked the light off and melted back into the night. She stood there for a long time, her heart pounding against her ribs. The feeling of safety in her own home was gone, shattered by that single beam of light. This was no longer about a garden. This was a violation. The water had now overflowed the glass. She showed the video to Marcus. He watched the short, jarring clip. He watched it again. He was silent for a long time, his jaw set like stone. The internal battle between husband and sheriff was over. A decision had been made. Finally, he looked at her, his voice low and steady, each word carrying an immense weight. Enough, he said. I will not let this continue. Tomorrow, we end this. It was not a threat. It was a promise. The line drawn in the soil. The morning sun was still gentle when Bart made the phone call. He stood in his kitchen, peering through the window at the house across the street. A general surveying the battlefield before the final assault. He was blind to the trap that had been set, deaf to the quiet mechanisms of justice already turning. He spoke into the phone, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur, filled with a sense of impending victory. Today is the day. Gary, he said, savoring the words. We are restoring order. After today, she will never ignore us again. At house number 214, the morning had a different tone. It was quiet, but it was the charged quiet of a held breath. Marcus told Alani he would be going into the office a little later than usual. He didn't elaborate. He just met her eyes. A silent communication passing between them. Trust me. Follow the plan. He had a strategy. A sequence of events he had mentally rehearsed through the sleepless hours of the night. Meanwhile, buoyed by Bart's confident directive, Operation Landscape Restoration was set in motion. Bart and Gary emerged from Bart's garage. Not as neighbors, but as a self-appointed task force. They were armed, not with weapons, but with the tools of their intended violation: a sharp spade, a heavy garden hoe, an empty, rattling wheelbarrow that sounded unnervingly loud in the morning stillness. They didn't hesitate at the edge of the property. They crossed the invisible line between the public sidewalk and Alani's private yard with a sense of righteous purpose. They were on a mission. Alani was in her kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug. When she saw the movement through the window, two men, Hadiart, the shovel, her heart seized in her chest. A sudden, cold fist of fear. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering in the sink. For a paralyzing second, she was frozen. Then, Marcus's voice echoed in her mind. Record everything. The instruction was an anchor in the swirling panic. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She grabbed her phone from the counter. Her thumb, finding the video icon. The small red light blinked on. She was recording. Only then did she walk to her front door, pull it open, and step outside to face them. Her voice was surprisingly steady when she spoke. You are on my property. I need you to leave. Now. Bart, standing back like a supervisor, scoffed. He was holding his clipboard, the symbol of his fake authority. Good morning to you, too, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. We're here as representatives of the community's Aesthetic and Security Committee. We're simply here to help you rectify this non-compliant situation, to clean up this mess. This is private property, Alani repeated, her voice rising slightly. Her phone held steady, aimed at their faces. You are trespassing. Leave now, or I will call the police. The verbal confrontation escalated quickly. Bart continued to spout his nonsensical regulations, his confidence growing with every word he spoke. Alani stood her ground. Her simple, repeated demand to leave acting as a stone wall against his flood of words. Gary, standing beside the wheelbarrow, grew visibly agitated. He looked from Bart's smug face to Alani's unwavering resistance. He was a man running on borrowed confidence, and it was beginning to fray. Just get started. Gary, Bart commanded, waving a dismissive hand towards the sunflowers. Ignore her. That was the spark, fueled by Bart's order and his own simmering rage at Alani's defiance. Gary lost control. The thin veneer of his deputized authority cracked, revealing the raw frustration beneath. Had took a step towards Alani. You have no right to film us, he yelled, his face turning a blotchy red. He lunged forward and slapped the phone from her hand. It clattered to the grass. Before she could react, he grabbed her upper arm, his fingers digging in. Hard. The shock of the physical contact, the sudden pain, stole her breath. You're interfering with an official enforcement action, he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and fury. His grip tightened. We have the right to detain you. It was in that precise, terrible moment, as his words hung in the stunned air, that a new sound emerged. The quiet crunch of tires on asphalt. A dark blue, unmarked Ford Explorer had pulled up silently to the curb. It was the kind of vehicle that blended in until you realized it was watching. A car door opened with a solid, definitive click. The world seemed to slow down. Bart and Gary froze, their heads snapping towards the vehicle. Alani, held fast in Gary's grip, could only turn her head. On the grass, her phone lay on its side. The lens, miraculously, was still recording. It was pointed upwards, capturing a patch of blue sky, the green leaves of a maple tree, and the moment a single, immaculately polished leather dress shoe planted itself firmly on the pavement. A tall, powerful figure began to emerge from the driver's seat. The badge and the begonias. The figure that emerged from the Ford Explorer was Marcus Thorne. He was not in uniform. He wore simple blue jeans and a plain, button-down shirt. The sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked like any other man on his way to a Saturday morning errand. He closed the car door softly behind him, the sound barely registering over the frantic pounding in Alani's chest. For a moment, Bart and Gary were simply startled. Their bravado faltered. But then, recognition dawned. This wasn't the police. This was just him, the husband. The realization acted like a shot of adrenaline, reigniting their foolish courage. Their fear was instantly replaced by an even deeper arrogance. Well, look who decided to show up. Bart sneered. Recovering his composure with remarkable speed, he puffed out his chest, gripping his clipboard like a shield. Are you planning to use force? I'll have you know we are official representatives, enforcing community regulations. Gary, emboldened by Bart's defiance, tightened his grip on Alani's arm. The pain made her wince. He glared at Marcus, a brutish challenge in his eyes. He was no longer just a handyman. In his mind, he was a lawman facing down a civilian obstructionist. Marcus did not react. He did not rush forward. He did not shout. His movements were slow, deliberate, and radiated an absolute, unnerving calm. His eyes took in the entire scene with a practiced, sweeping gaze. A threat assessment. He noted Gary's hand clamped on his wife's arm. He noted the fear and the fierce determination in Alani's eyes. He noted the phone on the ground, its small red light still blinking. A silent, digital witness. He noted the curtains twitching in the windows of the neighboring houses. Witnesses. The entire situation was cataloged and processed in a fraction of a second. Then, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning air with the clarity of a ringing bell. It was deep, steady, and carried an undeniable weight of command. Let go of my wife, he said. He paused, his eyes locked on Gary's. Now, Gary actually laughed. A short, ugly, nervous sound. You think you can tell us what to do? Who in the hell do you think you are? It was the question Marcus had been waiting for. Slowly, without breaking eye contact with Gary, Marcus reached his right hand inside his casual shirt. For a split second, Gary flinched back, a primal fear flickering in his eyes. He thought Marcus was reaching for a weapon, but what emerged was not a gun. It was a simple, black leather wallet. Marcus flipped it open with a practiced flick of his thumb. There, nestled against the dark leather, something caught the morning sun and threw back a brilliant, sharp-edged glint of light. A 5-pointed silver star, a symbol of ultimate, unimpeachable authority in this county. The badge of the sheriff of Havenwood County. I am Sheriff Marcus Thorne, he stated. His voice didn't change in volume, but each word landed with the force of a hammer blow. The casual neighbor was gone. The husband was gone. This was the law. And you, sire, he said, his gaze pinning Gary to the spot, are under arrest for assault in the 3rd degree and unlawful imprisonment. A profound, deathly silence fell over the lawn at 214 Magnolia Drive. The birds seemed to stop singing. The world held its breath. The color drained from Bart's face, leaving it a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Gary's hand dropped from Alani's arm as if he'd been electrocuted. His entire fantasy world, his brief and glorious career as an officer of Serenity Creek Security, had vaporized in the face of that single, shining star. And then, a new sound began to slice through the silence. Faint at first, then rapidly growing closer. Assurant, then another, the rising, urgent wail of approaching police cars. Marcus had called for backup before he had even stepped out of his vehicle. The first patrol car screamed around the corner and slid to a halt. 2 uniformed officers emerged, their faces a mixture of surprise and immediate recognition as they saw their new boss standing calmly in the yard. The rest was a blur of professional efficiency. Bart stood frozen, his clipboard slipping from his nerveless fingers and scattering his fake documents across the grass. Gary began to stammer, to apologize, his words tumbling over each other in a pathetic, terrified stream. They were cuffed. They were read their rights. They were placed separately in the back of the squad cars. Alani bent down and picked up her phone. She pressed the button, and the small red light went out. The recording was over. Marcus walked to her, his face softening as he wrapped his arms around her. He held her for a long moment. He looked over her head at her beautiful, defiant, and now trampled garden. He looked at the stunned, silent faces of his new neighbors peering from their doorways. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the confrontation was over. But the consequences were just beginning. The aftermath on Magnolia Drive. In the days that followed the arrests, a strange, heavy quiet descended upon Magnolia Drive. The frantic energy of the confrontation was replaced by a thick, awkward silence. The incident was the only thing anyone could think about. Yet no one seemed to know how to speak of it. The story, however, spread like wildfire through the rest of Serenity Creek. It traveled through phone calls, text messages, and neighborhood forums, each retelling adding a new layer of sensationalism or inaccuracy. In some versions, Bart and Gary were vigilante heroes. In others, they were monstrous criminals. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the complicated space between. Alani and Marcus chose to inhabit the silence. They did not engage with the gossip. They did not give statements or correct the false narratives. They trusted the legal process to do its work, to strip away the fiction and deal only with the cold, recorded facts of the matter. Their front yard, once a private project, was now a local landmark. People would drive by slowly, their gazes lingering on the sunflowers and the slightly trampled patch of grass where the climax had unfolded. The community itself fractured under the weight of the event. The reactions were a complex tapestry of guilt, denial, and quiet support. Some neighbors felt a profound and gnawing shame. They had watched the harassment escalate day by day and had done nothing. They had chosen the comfort of non-involvement over the moral courage of speaking up. One afternoon, a quiet knock came at Alani's door. It was old Mrs. Miller from the end of the street. In her trembling hands, she held a freshly baked apple pie. She didn't say much, just mumbled something about the sunflowers, looking lovely, and that she was sorry for all the trouble. Her eyes were filled with a sincere, unspoken apology for the entire street's cowardice. The pie was a peace offering, an acknowledgement. For Alani, it tested like forgiveness. Others, however, retreated into defensiveness. The few neighbors who had been sympathetic to Bart's cause now whispered that the situation had been a setup. They argued that Alani and Marcus had overreacted, but that they had used their hidden power unfairly against a man who was only trying to protect the neighborhood's standards. It was a way to absolve themselves of their own complicity, to reframe the story so they didn't have to see themselves as the neighbors of a bully, but as the neighbors of a victim. The legal system, meanwhile, moved with its slow, methodical grind. Bart and Gary were released on bail, their mugshots appearing briefly on the local news website. They faced a slate of serious criminal charges: assault, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy. The reality of their situation began to set in, and their brief, powerful alliance shattered under the pressure. Bart, in a desperate act of self-preservation, immediately turned on his deputy. During the first meeting with his expensive, sharp-suited lawyer, he crafted a new narrative. In this version, he was merely a concerned citizen who had been offering friendly advice. Gary Finch, he explained, was a troubled and overly zealous individual who had tragically misinterpreted his neighborly guidance. He claimed he was shocked and appalled when Gary became physical. It was a complete and total betrayal. A cowardly attempt to sever his own responsibility and leave Gary to face the consequences alone. The friendship, which had been built on a shared, toxic fantasy of power, could not survive its first encounter with reality. Gary was left adrift, represented by a weary but competent public defender. He was no longer a proud officer of Serenity Creek Security. He was just a scared, confused man who was beginning to understand that his quest for respect had led him to the edge of a cliff, and his mentor had just pushed him off. One evening, as twilight settled over their quiet street, Alani and Marcus sat together on their porch swing, looking out at the garden. The trampled spots were already beginning to recover. "I don't hate them, Marcus," Alani said softly, breaking a long silence. "I really don't. I just feel sad. It's a deep, aching sadness for them. Sad that they let fear and a need for control turn them into what they became. Sad for what they lost." Marcus put his arm around her, pulling her close. He understood. He had seen it 100 times in his career. The small grievances and petty hatreds that, left unchecked, could fester into something truly destructive. He looked at the garden, their small patch of beautiful rebellion, which had inadvertently become a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of the community around it. Alani leaned her head on his shoulder and watched as the fireflies began to light up the dusk. "Do you think a place like this can heal from something like this?" she wondered aloud. The question hung in the warm Georgia air. A quiet, unanswered challenge. The cuffs are on. The partnership is broken. And true characters are being revealed. Bart chooses cowardice, but Alani chooses compassion, asking if a community can heal, because here at Deepu Cater Stories, we believe crisis doesn't build character. It reveals it. If you are moved by Alani's capacity for grace, leave a single respect in the comments. You need to see what she does next. It's not about revenge. It's about rebuilding an entire neighborhood from the ground up. Lessons in humility and humanity. Can a place like this heal from something like this? The question Alani had asked in the quiet of the evening lingered in the air of Serenity Creek for weeks. The answer, when it began to emerge, was quiet and complicated. Healing was possible, but it could not be achieved through silence. It required something more. It required accountability. And perhaps a measure of grace. The day of the court proceedings arrived under a heavy, overcast sky. The small county courthouse buzzed with a low murmur of anticipation. Alani and Marcus were there, seated quietly in the back row. They were not required to attend, but they felt a responsibility to see the story through to its legal conclusion, to bear witness not for revenge, but for closure. Gary Finch was the first to face the judge, dressed in a borrowed suit that hung loosely on his frame. He looked smaller, diminished. Stripped of all his manufactured authority, his public defender stood beside him. But when it came time to speak, Gary spoke for himself. His voice was low and unsteady, but his words were clear. He pled guilty to all charges. He offered no excuses. He spoke of his own feelings of inadequacy, of his desire to feel important, and of how easily he had been manipulated by a stronger, more confident personality. He expressed a deep and seemingly genuine remorse for his actions, specifically apologizing for laying his hands on Alani and for violating her sense of safety. He had been a follower, and he had followed a man off a moral cliff. The judge listened intently, his gaze stern but not without a flicker of understanding. The sentence was lenient: 2 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. A chance. Then came Bartholomew Higgins. Bart's approach was entirely different. His expensive lawyer did most of the talking, painting a picture of a devoted, civic-minded retiree who had simply been misunderstood. When Bart himself spoke, his words were a tangled web of justifications and deflections, He portrayed himself as the victim of an aggressive newcomer who refused to assimilate. He never took full responsibility, never admitted to the fraud of the letters or the malice behind the harassment. He was sorry for the misunderstanding, but not for his actions. It was a performance of hollow contrition. The judge, a man who had presided over countless cases of human folly, saw right through it. He spoke of the difference between protecting community standards and terrorizing a neighbor. He spoke of the arrogance of creating false authority. Bart was found guilty. His sentence was heavier: probation, insignificant fine, and a court order to attend and complete a 12-week anger management course. Justice, in its methodical way, had been served. But Alani knew that legal justice was only one part of the story. The social fabric of their street was still torn. A few days after the sentencing, she made a phone call to the district attorney's office. It was an unusual request, one that required her to swallow her own pain and anger and reach for something higher. The following week, Gary Finch received a letter detailing his community service assignment. He had expected to be picking up trash along the highway or cleaning public restrooms. Instead, his instructions were specific. He was to report to a Mrs. Eleanor Miller at the end of Magnolia Drive. His duties were to repair her broken fence, weed her overgrown flower beds, and repaint her peeling porch railings. It was an act of quiet, radical grace from Alani. She had seen Mrs. Miller's small act of solidarity, the wink, the pie. She knew the elderly widow struggled to keep up with the physical demands of her home, and she saw in Gary not a monster, but a lost man who needed a way back. Punitive service would only deepen his resentment, but restorative service that actually helped someone he knew, that allowed him to use his handyman skills for good, could be a path to redemption. It was a chance for him to truly contribute to the community he had helped to poison. Marcus had supported her decision completely. As a lawman, he was sworn to uphold the letter of the law, but as a man, he understood that true justice often requires a dose of humanity that cannot be written into any statute. He saw in his wife a strength that went beyond mere resilience. It was the strength to heal not just oneself, but the world around you. One Saturday afternoon, Alani was in her own garden, which was now thriving, full of life and color. She glanced down the street. She saw Gary, on his knees, carefully pulling weeds from Mrs. Miller's garden. The old woman was sitting on her porch steps, a glass of lemonade in her hand, talking to him. There was no animosity in the scene, no awkwardness, just two neighbors, sharing a sunny afternoon. Alani watched them for a moment, and a feeling of profound peace settled over her. It was not the triumphant feeling of victory. It was the quiet, hopeful feeling of a wound beginning to heal. A month later, a notice went up on the community bulletin board. An official meeting of the Serenity Creek Homeowners Association. For the first time in years, the meeting was packed. People stood along the walls of the small community clubhouse. They weren't there to argue about the acceptable height of lawns or the approved colors for mailboxes. The agenda had a single item, proposed by a group of neighbors and typed in bold letters: building a better community, a conversation on respect, inclusion, and our shared future. The real change was just beginning. The seeds of change. Summer bled into autumn, and Serenity Creek was painted in hues of gold, red, and orange. The air grew crisp, and the fierce Georgia sun softened into a gentle, golden light. On Magnolia Drive, the story was no longer about a confrontation. It was about the quiet, powerful aftermath. Alani's garden was the most visible sign of the change. What had started as an act of personal defiance had become a beloved neighborhood landmark. It was a riot of late-season color, with asters, goldenrods, and the still-proud sunflowers standing tall. Bees buzzed lazily among the blossoms. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes now stopped to admire it. It was no longer a violation, it was an inspiration. Inspired by Alani's example, small pockets of rebellion began to sprout throughout the neighborhood. The Millers, a young couple at the end of the cul-de-sac, dug up a perfect square of their lawn and planted a vegetable patch. Mr. Henderson, once a staunch defender of the all-grass aesthetic, planted a colorful butterfly garden around his mailbox after his granddaughter became fascinated with the monarchs that now frequented Alani's yard. The rigid, uniform green of Serenity Creek was slowly being embroidered with the vibrant, diverse threads of individuality. The unspoken rule of conformity had been broken, and in its place, something far more beautiful was beginning to grow. The changes went deeper than landscaping. The relationship between Gary Finch and Mrs. Miller blossomed into a genuine, if unlikely, friendship. After his community service hours were completed, Gary kept coming around. He would fix her leaky faucet or help her bring in her heavy groceries. She, in turn, would share stories of her late husband and offer him a slice of homemade cake. In helping her, Gary found the sense of purpose and respect he had craved, not through intimidation, but through simple, honest acts of kindness. He was no longer Bart Higgins' shadow. He was becoming his own man. Marcus, in his official capacity as sheriff, also initiated a change. He launched a new community outreach program called Coffee with the Sheriff, holding informal meetings in local diners and coffee shops. He wanted to demystify law enforcement, to build relationships of trust, and to ensure that no one in his county felt as unheard or as isolated as Gary Finch had. He wanted to prove that true authority wasn't about projecting power, but about fostering connection. The final chapter of the conflict closed on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Alani and Marcus were sitting together on their porch swing, a familiar ritual that had become their sanctuary. They watched the autumn leaves drift down, blanketing the garden in a soft carpet of color. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They were simply breathing in the peace they had fought so hard to secure. Alani looked at her thriving garden, at the new vegetable patch down the street, at the changing leaves. She realized that true power was never in Bart's fraudulent letters or in his desperate need for control. It wasn't even in the silver badge that Marcus wore. As important as that was, the real, lasting power was in the seeds. The seeds of courage she had planted in her own front yard, the seeds of compassion she had offered to a man who had wronged her, the seeds of change that were now taking root all over their small community. A neighbor, a man who had once crossed the street to avoid her, walked by with his dog. He paused at their walkway. "Your garden looks beautiful, Alani," he said, and his smile was genuine. "Really beautiful." Alani smiled back. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a welcome. It was an acknowledgement. It was the sound of a wound finally closing. And in the quiet peace of the autumn afternoon in Serenity Creek, watching the last of the sunlight filter through the trees, Alani Reid knew, with a certainty that filled her soul, that she was finally, truly, home. This story reminds us that true authority doesn't come from a polo shirt with a fake logo, but from integrity and respect. Bart and Gary sought power over their neighbor, while Marcus and Alani used their power to protect and heal. It's a powerful lesson in how the smallest kingdom can create the largest monsters, and how quiet strength can ultimately bring the brightest light. I'm truly interested to hear what this story made you feel. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to explore more stories about the complexities of human nature, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Deepu Cater Stories. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Your presence here is deeply appreciated.